It's difficult to put into words my thoughts on Ocarina of Time, though I've certainly got a lot to say. I've probably played this game at least 20 times over the last 2 decades, be it on N64 emulation or the 3DS remake. It was the very first Zelda game I ever played, and while it's far from my favorite, its impact on myself and the gaming industry as a whole is undeniable. And it certainly deserves the praise it gets, since it, alongside Mario 64, were pioneers of their respective genres. I find myself in a bit of a pinch, though. I'm far past the point of feeling any sort of passion towards this game. I neither love nor hate it anymore, and my praise for it is about on par with my criticism. When I play through it, I'm not actively engaging with the gameplay mentally so much as I am just going through the motions. On the one hand, it allows me to better observe how the game communicates itself to the player, but it also keeps me from having fun. Let's set the record straight that I'm a strong believer that being first at something doesn't by necessity make it qualify any more at being a masterpiece than later iterations of that concept that have since improved on it. Don't get me wrong, however, this isn't going to be an overtly negative review, or rather, I certainly hope it doesn't at the time of writing. I suppose the best place to start is the beginning of the story. I won't waste my breath on elements that are common knowledge at this point, but more so focus on how different aspects of the narrative are presented. That said, the game begins with the game's secondary character Navi being informed at the Great Deku Tree that Link needs her as his assigned fairy. A trivial detail, but it sets the game up to show off a rather entertaining opening segment of Navi flying through the Kokiri village from a first-person viewpoint, giving the player some foreknowledge to the town they'll be dropped into and a level of anticipation of what's to come. Many of the game's attempts at humor fall a bit flat as a result of its age, but even I find myself snickering at the bit where Navi runs herself into a fence. Shortly after leaving Link's house, you're more or less given full reign to explore Kokiri Village. It makes for a good opportunity to experiment with the game's core mechanics. There are plenty of vertical spaces to practice the game's auto-jumping and climbing mechanics, a pool of water to test swimming, and a myriad of tutorial NPCs and rocks to test various aspects of the game's Z-targeting feature, which I'll talk about in more detail in a later video. The game also offers you a safe area to practice your swordplay with a bunch of small stationary Deku Babas on the path to the Great Deku Tree. They don't actively attack you, and only cause damage if you come in direct contact with them, making them a relatively easy enemy to practice your combat skills. I think the only thing that really hurts Kokiri Forest is that the majority of the NPCs solely exist for tutorializing. Additionally, it exists as your first introduction to the shops you will never use again. The Zelda series as a whole has a bit of a problem making shops appealing for the most part, as many of the items that you might want from them are more easily obtained in just random chests and enemy drops. But I think there's no game more emblematic of this problem than Ocarina of Time, where the only shop that's even remotely necessary to progress in the game is this exact shop for the sole purpose of buying a Deku Shield. There's absolutely no reason to go to a shop again after this point. Now, whether or not this is an issue to you is really left up to opinion. On the one hand, it helps speed things along, not having to shop to maintain an inventory on your items, but I can't help but feel it's a failure of game design to have shops sprinkled throughout the entire game that serve no purpose whatsoever, leaving the in-game rupee economy kinda fucked. Unless you're after the handful of items that can only be purchased to get 100% completion, there's pretty much no reason to buy anything else. Until last year, I thought the Hylian Shield was a mandatory purchase as well, but alas, there's a free one in the Kakariko Graveyard. But I suppose that's enough rambling about the shops in Ocarina of Time. Let's get to talking about the Great Deku Tree. No, not the character. I mean, I guess we could, but he's not much more than a lore dump. He serves a far more important role as an intro dungeon. And as an intro dungeon, I've got mixed feelings. I think it's a pretty solid dungeon as a whole. The layout and puzzles are straightforward enough as to ease newcomers into the experience, and you're presented with a large vertical space that has you confront wall hazards that prevent you from climbing, i.e. Skulltulas. And the impedance of your progress forces you to explore the dungeon to find the slingshot to deal with them. As far as dungeon items go, I think the slingshot is one of the better ones. It serves a solid combat role and allows you to adjust to the game's iffy first-person aiming. and has some light puzzle-solving capabilities that don't feel too gimmicky. If forced, I'd say the item is let down primarily by having its existence compete with the hero bow. It just feels a tad redundant if I'm being completely honest, though admittedly, it serves its role far better than the slingshot that was featured in Twilight Princess, but that's a discussion for later. I think for the most part, the Great Deku Tree's level design communicates what it wants the player to do pretty well. Skulltulas and vines need to be shot, webs need to be burnt via torch, and there's what I can only generously call a riddle to be solved involving the order in which you must defeat some Deku Scrubs. As far as intro levels go, this is a solid one, but the one flaw I find is how you access the second underground half of the level, which to my knowledge isn't contextualized beyond a bit of dialogue from Navi. This moment in question being the web at the center of the Deku Tree, which can only be broken by jumping from the top of the room. This isn't terribly intuitive, and I can only think it could be improved by adding a torch to the third floor, or introducing the concept of burning webbing earlier in the game to go along with that. Or possibly just having you shoot an object from the ceiling that falls from the third story to bust through the web. Thankfully, the game isn't in such a position where it leaves you to guess what course of action you need to take to progress, but I'd rather these puzzles be solved on player knowledge and not information spoon-fed to you as you come across the puzzle. That said, there is a rather brilliantly put-together bit just after this, where you step on a switch that ignites a torch, which in turn burns down the webbing that's attached to it, introducing you to the game's light chemistry engine, which plays a role even in the later parts of the game. That's probably my favorite part of the dungeon, honestly. And with all this talk of webbing, we of course have to talk about everyone's favorite arachnid, Goma. This is a relatively straightforward boss fight, but it's a pretty solid one, I'd say. While it does sadly set the trend for the rest of the series of having a dungeon boss that requires a rather mechanical pattern of use item, attack with sword, Goma does actually allow for some variety in strategizing. The fight begins remarkably well by requiring the player look the boss dead in the eye to even start the fight, and in doing so it provides a fairly obvious hint as to the boss's weak point. I think this is equally intuitive had the game simply leapt headfirst into the fight with no instruction. But this really drives the point home, how you're meant to approach it, and in case you're some kind of idiot, you can also ask Navi. But as I was saying, the fight allows for some flexibility. After landing a few sword blows to the boss, he climbs up to the ceiling and spawns smaller enemies. During this time, you're presented with a few opportunities. You can either maintain a close distance to try and keep your Z targeting locked onto the boss's eye while it's vulnerable while it's laying eggs, which can get you some free hits in to stun it, or take a less risky approach and attack the eggs as they drop to reduce the number of potential threats waiting for you when the boss returns to the ground before you strike the eye. These options are let down slightly by how short the fight as a whole is, usually taking at most 2 full combos, but I think it's pretty good. And with its defeat, you're free to receive another lore dump before being thrust into Hyrule Field. Before you can leave, though, you're stopped by Saria for a rather touching moment where she gives you the fairy ocarina as a parting gift. While I think the characters in Ocarina of Time are on the weak side, I think this is a pretty effective scene, even if the sentimentality of it is weakened later on. And side note, just because it feels obligatory, Keipora Gaebora is awful. I like the idea of his setup for the mid-game, but his execution is simultaneously too wordy and too invasive for what amounts to little more than blatant tutorializing. It only really serves to hurt the game's already awkward pacing. Now let's talk about Hyrule Field. It's easy to shit on it for being a large open area that's full of not much of anything, and it is. So I did. But more importantly, I've got a far more specific complaint about it at the very start of the game. Assuming you don't side hop the entire way to Hyrule Castletown's gate, it's basically impossible to reach the gate before nightfall. Now, if there were more things to do to pass the time while you were traveling there your first time, this wouldn't be much of an issue. But unfortunately, you're gated both figuratively and literally from exploring some of the game's side content until you've met with Princess Zelda. Just about the only things you can do is hunt some gold Skulltulas and fight skeletons. One might think that you could attempt to get the Sun Song early to make the day come sooner, but it's a predicament where you can't access the song until you've obtained Zelda's Lullaby from Hyrule Castle. Of course, this isn't the end of the game's beginning pacing issues. Even once you get to Hyrule Castle, you're required to wait until the next morning to obtain a cuckoo egg from Marin to wake up her father so you can get in. While Marin and Terran make for an entertaining duo with a rather amusing gag of Terran being afraid of the scolding his daughter will give him, it's a bit too invasive in an already slow opening. Moving on. To get to Princess Zelda, you have to play a forced stealth section, which I think is actually fine. It's straightforward enough. Most games with forced stealth usually handle it poorly, but in the case of Ocarina of Time, it's short and sweet. The guards also have absolutely no peripheral vision, so it amounts to little more than avoiding the line of sight. It lacks depth, sure, but the sections where it comes up are reasonably fun breaks from the rest of the gameplay. Next, of course, is the meeting with Zelda, in which you receive another lore dump and are introduced to the game's primary antagonist, Ganondorf, which is Ganon's first human incarnation in the Zelda series. Pretty neat first, as he does leave quite the impact. I didn't bring it up earlier because it wasn't really relevant at the time, but the foreshadowing of Ganondorf as an imposing figure in Link's Nightmare, with him chasing off Zelda and firing off powerful magic at Link, leaves a real impact I can't really say any of the earlier Zeldas had achieved at this point. It's a good example of show don't tell. After that introduction, you receive Zelda's letter, a trivial detail I'd probably skip, but it replaces the clue in your inventory. So I'm just curious what happened to it, honestly. All I've got is this mental image of Link handing Zelda a chicken while she's handing him a letter. I mean, I don't have anything more substantial to say about this encounter. I just thought that was kind of funny. This segment also acts as your introduction to the Ocarina mechanics. The Ocarina as a whole is in a weird position of being versatile in its usage, while simultaneously not really doing much of anything at all. Arguably the most important singular song you'll get in the entire game is Zelda's Lullaby, which serves as a glorified key, opening dungeons, doors, waterfalls, summoning fairies and fountains, of which some of these uses seem completely arbitrary. As a bit of world-building flavor, it's a nice touch, as it's quite literally said that it announces the arrival of someone who serves the royal family of Hyrule, which explains why folks at the Zora's Domain and Goron Village would permit you to enter after hearing it. But conversely, it makes it a bit confusing when it summons a bolt of lightning to annihilate a tombstone, so that you can get a completely different song. I'm personally quite fond of the Ocarina on the whole, as it allows you to freestyle ineffectual notes, but I think on the whole it's a bit too muddled by just having several redundant songs, which we'll get to in about 7 years. Suffice it to say, I don't think that the series' music mechanics really got fleshed out until Majora's Mask and Wind Waker. At this point of the game, the only noteworthy songs you can obtain are Zelda's Lullaby, which I've already mentioned, Saria's Song, Epona's Song, and the Sun Song. Saria's Song is useful if you're at a loss as to what you need to do to go forward after you've stepped away from the game for a while. Epona's Song is solely to summon Epona if you're at Lon Lon Ranch, at least for now, making it largely useless in the early game, though it is important later. And the Sun Song, which allows you to change day to night and night to day, and has the additional effect of stunning Redeads and Gibdo. Especially handy if you're 6 years old and the screams haunt your nightmares to this day. I can still hear the screams! The screams! Before I get too far ahead of myself, let's talk about Castletown and Kakariko Village. I realize that might be a bit of a strange note to stop on, but town design is one of those things in games that I tend to get pretty nitpicky about. And I want to highlight these because they represent both the best and worst town design in the Zelda series. Let's get the bad out of the way first. I don't like Castletown in the slightest. Unlike the other towns, it has no verticality. It's basically just a 2D image that you get to run around for a bit and talk to NPCs. The only thing it has going for it is a slingshot gallery and bombshell bowling. Fairly delightful mini-games, which I don't participate in, at least not during this playthrough. Don't look at me like that, it's not a 100% complete run. That said, if we exclude the mini-games, the only other thing of value in this town is the Temple of Time. I know, some of you are going to point towards the Happy Mask shop and side quest, but the masks are almost entirely aesthetic, save for the Mask of Truth. As far as I'm concerned, it's a waste of time. Moving on to a more positive section of the game, Kakariko Village might actually be my favorite town in the entire Zelda series, as it signifies to me the point at which the game actually becomes fun. Okay, I know it's probably clear I'm talking about the Ocarina of Time iteration, but I'll repeat for clarity just in case. Ocarina of Time's Kakariko Village is my favorite town in the Zelda series. It's a rather brilliant layout. Much like the Kokiri Forest, it's fairly vertical and allows for a lot of experimentation with the platforming mechanics. The NPCs don't just spout tutorials. Unlike Kokiri Village, Kakariko Village's layout is a lot tighter, so I personally find it more fun to traverse, which is helped a fair bit by the Cuckoo Gathering side quest, which helps introduce you to alternate forms of traversal, namely gliding with cuckoos, a really cool mechanic, which basically never gets used for any puzzle solving until the Deku Leaf of Wind Waker and the Nightmare Fuel Uka of Twilight Princess. It's a real shame too, because when the mechanic is actually used, it's really cool. This doesn't really have anything to do with Kakariko Village in particular, but if I don't say it now, I'll probably forget. One thing that really stands out to me about 3D Zelda games is the strong character design. Ocarina of Time started this admirable trend, but almost every single NPC has a distinct and memorable design, save for the non-human races. With that out of the way, it's time for a hike up Death Mountain. I don't actually have much to say about the mountain itself, it's more or less just a trail that leads to the Goron village with a handful of diversions and enemies. The only noteworthy touch from my perspective is the opportunity to interact with Gorons before visiting said village. First one simply being a safe encounter with one of these rocky fellows chilling out in front of the Dunko's cavern, and the second introducing you to their thing being rolling violently. It's pretty amusing, as it shows you that Gorons are gentle rockmen, but have a bad habit of unintentionally harming passersby because they can't see where they're rolling, and don't seem to know their own strength. It's as comical as it is hazardous. That said, I do like Death Mountain. Even if it's mostly just a singular path, it makes for arguably the most standout set piece in Ocarina of Time. And of all the iterations of Death Mountain, I think Ocarina's has the most distinct features by virtue of the halo of smoke around the volcanic caldera, even if the actual act of exploring it is far less involved than the later versions. Goron City is nothing to write home about, really. While it features shops and NPCs, it lacks any real personality and towing features that make it easy to navigate. I like the idea of a city built into the walls of a series of cylindrical steps, but it just feels a bit uninspired otherwise. Darunia is the only noteworthy NPC, and he's pretty much just a bro. I do find it amusing that you earn his respect in part by playing his favorite song on the ocarina and watching him jam out, and that scene alone makes the visit worth it. Before we move on to talk about the Dodongo Caverns, let's get to the path to the Zora's Domain out of the way, since it follows a similar process to the Gorons. Much like Death Mountain, the path to Zora's Domain is largely linear. It's a bit less obvious of a way forward without a hint from Navi, as it lacks the distinct set piece that is Death Mountain, but for the most part, it's just a minor platforming challenge that I think is pretty well executed. And yes, I'm saying that because you can use the Cuckoo. After clearing the path, you're introduced to the Zora's Domain, which has even less going on in it than Goron City. Zoras are a rather standout race, much like the Gorons, but suffer the same problem in that they all look the same apart from the plot-important NPCs. Beyond that, you're required to play a short rupee gathering minigame in order to get yet another letter from a princess to proceed forward. King Zora isn't very impactful, at least not as much as Darunia, I'd say, but he certainly isn't forgettable. I will give credit where credit is due, though. I think the way you enter Jabu's belly is pretty clever, as you're provided clues in dialogue that Princess Ruto was eaten while feeding it, and it only stands to reason that you can get in by mimicking her actions. The developers also rather graciously provide you with an empty bottle to catch the fish in. I can imagine it would have been quite annoying to have to figure it out to obtain one had you not done the Cuckoo side quest earlier in the game. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to Dodongo Caverns. Dodongo Caverns is a pretty basic Zelda dungeon, but there are a handful of things about it that help it stand out. First off being that you need to utilize bombs to even enter the place. This quickly establishes that bombs will be a core mechanic of the dungeon. I feel like the existence of bomb flowers does hurt the mid-dungeon reward of the bomb bag a fair bit, since it never feels necessary until you reach the boss, but it's a good enough reward. I'm personally quite fond of the massive Dodongo skeleton that's stuck in the far wall from the entrance, as it implies a certain amount of history and lore about the location, without having to overload you with exposition. It even hints as to what the imposing boss King Dodongo will be like. I've personally got mixed feelings about this boss. Once again, leaving aside Navi's advice, I don't think there's anything about King Dodongo's design that really hints that you need to throw bombs in its mouth, beyond that it's just a Zelda boss, and that's the thing to do. It also lacks options for how to approach it. It's very mechanical in its approach. Throw a bomb in Dodongo's mouth, block, rinse, and repeat until dead. It establishes what I'd call a rather worrying trend for 3D Zelda bosses for the series, but this is early enough in the game for it to be overlooked. Jabu Jabu's belly stands out quite a lot thanks to its unique pulsating fleshy aesthetic and the fact that it's the only Zelda dungeon in the entire game to be built around an escort quest of sorts. Basic premise for the dungeon, for those of you who either forgot or haven't played, is that Princess Ruto is eaten by Jabu Jabu and you have to rescue her, but she refuses to leave until you've helped her find her lost item. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who you ask, this means you have to bring her with you throughout the dungeon. I personally think it's pretty well handled, in that where she is located is entirely within the player's control, as the only way she'll move around is by carrying her. I know some people don't like this about her, but look at it this way, she can't be hurt, and she's a fairly reliable projectile to throw at the various enemies of the dungeon. Yes, really! Incidentally, it's also hilarious! I'm not overly pleased with the dungeon's mid-boss, though. I feel the giant Octorok moves a bit too fast to apply the strategy the game seems to want you to do to damage it, and in all of my playthroughs I've usually just defaulted to the habit of soaking up hits and stunning it once it turns back around. I'm sure there is some method I'm just completely unaware of, but forgive me, I apparently have not figured it out over the last 20 years. The dungeon's main boss, Baronade, is better, but beyond it following the dungeon's aesthetic, I find it more annoying than anything. I mean, yeah, it falls into the same trend I mentioned earlier, but beyond that, it's just hard to find a good opening, considering all the jellyfish deflecting the boomerang. It seems almost entirely luck-based as to whether or not your boomerang actually slips past them during the first phases of the fight, and I'm not too fond of it. That said, I do like how after each of these two dungeons, you get a little character moment where you establish a bond with Darunia and Princess Ruto. It rounds off the characters just enough so that they stick with you, and it lays the groundwork for the second half of the game. After clearing Dodongo Caverns and Jabu Jabu's belly, it's time to move on to the Temple of Time, and by extension the scene from Link's early game prophetic dream playing out in reality. The moment is as impactful as it was the first time, so I'm not really interested in talking about it specifically, but rather I want to talk about the titular Ocarina of Time you received from it. I know this isn't exactly an original opinion, but I feel like obtaining the Ocarina so early on hurts the sentimental value of the Fairy Ocarina you received from Saria, especially when the Fairy Ocarina is completely removed from your inventory. I'm not really sure what could have been done to improve this issue. Maybe getting a different item from Saria, or just obtaining the Ocarina of Time from her. She is a sage, after all, so it wouldn't be completely out of the question for her to have it, and it would provide a subtle tell for her role in the second half of the game. Or heck, just have the Fairy Ocarina play the Song of Time. I know some of these solutions aren't perfect, but I think they're at least, in theory, better than Link simply casting that gift away at the first opportunity he gets. With that out of the way, one might argue that this is where the game truly begins. I know I certainly would. And after you obtain the Master Sword, you find yourself 7 years in the future, where the world has fallen under Ganon's rule. Well, after some more dull lore-dump cutscenes from Raura, who is exactly as annoying in Sage form as he is in Owl form Kepora Gebora. and Sheik, the mysterious ninja. It's Zelda. Sheik is Zelda. I'll talk about Sheik more at length later, but for now, they just exist to point you towards the hook shot alongside hints as to the location of all of the elemental temples. Brief aside, again, I like the little racing minigame you do at the crypt of the late gravekeeper Dompe. It's charming to see this man floating around talking shit and making you run through a tomb full of undead to get a hook shot. It's a bit cheeky that he drops fireballs in your path to slow you down. I wouldn't really mind it, since it's added hazards that make it more challenging, but the camera kind of screws you over on sharp turns when he drops them. And while we're on the subject of racing minigames that grant you new means of transportation that you can do before the start of the new dungeons, let's talk about horse races in Epona. I'm a bit on the fence about this one, or maybe over the fence. Anyway, I feel like Ingo's in the right on this one. They try to portray him as an antagonist, and he is. But I don't know. He's not lying when he claims that he's hardworking, and he certainly seems to be working harder than Terran. Perhaps kicking him out of the home might have been a bit too much, but as far as antagonist figures in Zelda go, he kinda doesn't fill the role terribly well. The worst thing he does is cheat against you when you race him for a horse, and it's the race itself I'm not fond of. Not really because it's cheating, but because it's not so much a test of skill, so much as a test of whether or not you're able to stay in front of Ingo the entire time. Maybe if it integrated some of the fence hopping, it'd at least been more of a challenge, but we'll talk about actual good horse races in the next Zelda critique. I don't actually know if Epona is 100% necessary to complete the game, but I know it's needed to get the big Goron sword, which is why I go after it so early. Now let's talk about the future, particularly this future. I'm not overly fond of the time travel aspect of Ocarina of Time. Ironically, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a poorly realized version of the Dark World scenario from Link to the Past. But I think most of my issue is more to do with it only being a single point at which you can travel through time, as opposed to the multiple warp areas for the Dark World, or later entries such as Oracle of Ages and Lorule. It's not without its good points, though. Hyrule doesn't change as drastically as the other settings do in other entries I've referenced, but it does have some distinct changes. The first and most noteworthy thing you'll notice is that the smoke halo around Death Mountain has become a much more imposing flaming halo instead. Though the most dramatic change is right next door, of course, with the fallen castle town now full of walking nightmares, and Ganondorf's sick floating lava castle. Though there is something a bit off about the Redeads in Castletown. I'm not sure what's going on with the programming side of things, but for whatever reason, the Redead screams don't seem to cause you to freeze on the spot. Other than that, Kokiri Village is now overrun with monsters, which I promptly neglected, and Zora's Domain is completely frozen over, which unfortunately you can't really do anything about. A bit disappointing, honestly. I don't think the changes to Hyrule really warranted the time skip and time travel mechanics. It's hard to say what might have led to this decision, but for what it's worth, I don't think it hurts the game too much. Now, currently the only accessible dungeons at this point of the game are the Forest, Fire, and Water temples respectively. The Shadow and Spirit Temple are gated for largely arbitrary reasons, but we'll get to them when we get to them. As far as I'm concerned, all of the dungeons we're about to discuss are pretty stellar, so let's get to them. As far as temples go, they start off pretty strong with the Forest Temple. Unlike some of the later temples, this one stands out for having an overall architecture that implies it might have been habitable at one point or another. Its age is depicted primarily through the vast amount of overgrowth running along the walls and structures, but also carries with it a supernatural vibe, lent to by the features that you can encounter within, and some of the corridors that twist unnaturally, hinting at the true extent of Ganon's reach, and how it can even corrupt the places cherished in childhood. The first thing that always strikes me when I enter the place that drags me kicking and screaming back to my own childhood is the overtly haunting music. I'm not well versed in music terms to really describe it, but when you hear it, it really sticks to your memory, and I personally find it to be the most recognizable of the Ocarina of Time dungeon themes. Ocarina of Time on the whole has a bigger focus on ambient pieces for its dungeon music compared to a lot of the later entries, save for Majora's Mask. Whether it's a better approach than what followed is largely up to opinion, but I do find it pretty neat that we saw a return to this style of dungeon music with Breath of the Wild. Fittingly enough, with the tone the music sets, you're quickly met with the 4 Poes who steal the torches lining the center of the room. This establishes a few things: that the dungeon has a noteworthy supernatural presence, and that the torches, and by extension the Poes that stole their flames, need to be hunted down to progress. It's essentially a key, and a strong setup for a dungeon, as it gives you a goal, a hub from which most of the dungeon branches, and some idea of the type of enemy you'll be dealing with on the off chance you've not encountered a Poe until now. From here, the dungeon branches into multiple paths, ranging from the large indoor gardens overrun with monsters to mysterious twisting corridors which make for a very memorable dungeon set piece. The actual act of solving the dungeon's puzzles isn't really much to write home about, but hunting the Poes is interesting at the very least. The first 2 are the most straightforward, as they appear as paintings on 2 symmetrical stairwells. They're introduced alongside the hero's bow, which should be an obvious hint as to what you need to do to take the Poes on. And the third involves a rather out-of-place block-pushing puzzle. But I do like how they handle the 4th and final Poe. It's something they absolutely could have skipped out on, but the Poe is visibly upset and crying over the loss of her sisters, and engages you in battle as soon as you approach. It's not a complicated fight, but it's more interesting than the first 3. It involves distinguishing the real Poe from among a set of clones, which would be complicated if she didn't spin the moment they all spawned in. But that's a relatively minor issue. After that, there's a rather simple wall-moving puzzle before entering the boss fight with Phantom Ganon. And I'm going to be honest, I don't like this fight at all. The first fight is okay. It involves trying to shoot the real Phantom among clones hiding in the paintings lining the walls, but the method isn't terribly obvious. For those who might not know, the real Phantom Ganon can be distinguished by a lighter color palette when observed through the paintings. But there's not really a way to get a hint towards that, as at this point of the game, Navi doesn't really provide much in the way of helpful information about bosses. But that's not why I don't like the fight. That part is easy enough. No, the issue I have lies in the energy ball tennis battle. It's probably just me, but for whatever reason, the depth perception for hitting the ball always screws me up in this particular fight. I don't have this issue with the regular fight against Ganondorf at the end of the game. I think it's the camera angle, honestly. But that's the best guess I've got in terms of the root cause of this problem. Maybe I'm just bad at this. I'm being completely serious, though. If you've had this issue too, I'm curious to know how many people have had this problem with Phantom Ganon, but not with the actual Ganondorf fight. But that's that. You defeat Phantom Ganon and you get the Forest Medallion. Next on the list is the Fire Temple. As mentioned before, not much has changed about Death Mountain beyond the aesthetic of that sick fire halo and the addition of boulders inexplicably tumbling down the mountain in a distinct repetitive pattern. Beyond that, it's mostly just finding the entrance to the temple. The main plot hook for the Fire Temple is that Goron City has had a very noticeable level of population decline, drawing more attention to the singular Goron rolling around the second level who actually turns out to be Darunia's son. It's a rather insignificant detail, but in honor of saving the Gorons from the Dodongos, Darunia names his son after you whenever you named your character as. It's a nice bit of world building, and it helps reaffirm your brotherhood with Darunia himself without contacting him directly. Well, yet. But leaving that aside, it turns out that all the Gorons have been kidnapped and caged in the Fire Temple to be sacrificed to the ancient dragon Volvagia, which raises the stakes by a fair amount, and it makes for a much more meaningful driving force than the Kokiri, who, despite being in a monster-infested village, didn't really seem all that bothered by it. So, of course, that brings us to the dungeon proper. The Fire Temple is odd. I've got fairly mixed feelings on it. I guess I'll start with the music. It's great. And this is a bit petty, but having grown up on the original N64 version, I feel like the loss of the chanting on the music track and later re-releases of the game does take away somewhat from the overall feel of the place. I don't know why the Zelda devs went for such a haunting overtone with the original sound direction, but I really digged that. And when this particular track is left with just its instrumentation, it just feels a bit hollow by comparison. If I recall correctly, the reason for the chant removal had to do with some controversy of it being an Islamic song, which, fair enough. If it's trouble for the company, then so be it. But I'd honestly rather they have replaced it with good vocal sound design rather than leave it as this perfectly adequate, but far less impactful version. Music aside, as far as criticism goes, I don't really have anything bad to say about the level design itself. It's fairly good at telegraphing what it wants you to accomplish to progress. The dungeon's weapons integrate rather organically into your normal gameplay and puzzle solving, which, as it's a hammer, you can probably guess what you'd use it for and be right. But beyond that, I think it's more of its contextualization. While I think that the threat of the Goron sacrifice being on the line is a strong plot hook if I've ever seen one, it's let down by the peculiar decision to have their cells be remarkably easy to unlock, and every single cell containing a key to progress in the dungeon. From purely a gameplay perspective, it works. It ensures that the player is able to progress while making sure that they don't miss any of the imprisoned Gorons, but from a storytelling perspective, why are the Gorons locked in cages with keys? Why are the cages locked with a mechanical switch rather than a key lock? And most importantly, why did they lock the boss key to Volvagia with one of them? Yes, it's obvious from a gameplay perspective, and I'm being overly nitpicky. It's a good dungeon. Great, even. But, that aspect just annoys me. They do establish pretty early on in the dungeon what's required to progress. Upon entering the dungeon, you're immediately funneled towards Harunia by a locked door. He states that you need to help free the Gorons while he keeps Volvagia busy in case that wasn't already clear to you, and it establishes where the boss room is located and draws immediate attention to the large stone pillar in the ceiling that needs to be dropped to access said room. It gives a sense of scale for the dungeon that tells you that backtracking isn't really necessary to return to the boss room, as a shortcut is established preemptively. It's a really good touch. I mentioned this with the Forest Temple as well, but this game does a surprisingly good job at conveying through game design. That said, I don't like Volvagia. Oh, surprise, surprise, Critica doesn't like a boss in Ocarina of Time. What's that? 4 out of 5 now? Surely you hate all of them. Well, let me tell you why I hate Volvagia. It's literally just whack-a-mole. There is very little else to this fight. The dragon pokes his head out and you smack it back down, and then you avoid his attacks while he flies around trying to get you. There's nothing else. It's not hard, it's not obtuse, it's just kinda dull. It's a shame too, because Volvagia as a plot device has a pretty imposing presence and a pretty nifty design. I guess I'm obligated to give some praise to the actual fight, though. It's cool when Volvagia dies and burns his own body to the bone until nothing but his skull remains. And it's also, incidentally, hilarious that you can ask Navi for advice when he's just a skull just before he turns into a heart container. And once again, we get a medallion, a touching reunion with a long-lost friend, and newfound drive to go on to the water town. What? What's that? We're going to the ice cavern. Okay, then. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, the Zora's Domain is now frozen over, with not a single NPC in sight. Lord Jabu Jabu is gone. It's not entirely clear where it went. I would assume he died, but it's never outright stated. At least not that I could find or recall. Jabu Jabu's lake, pond, body of water, let's go with body of water, is now frozen over, much like the associated domain. This dungeon, if you can call it that, is just a rush for iron boots. Every puzzle in this dungeon is just collecting silver rupees. It doesn't make much sense logically, but as a platforming puzzle, it's pretty interesting. I'm particularly fond of the sliding block puzzle. Ocarina of Time loves sliding block puzzles, as much as the previous entries in the series. But the fact that the ice-based puzzles result in them careening forward until they collide with an object makes it far more interesting. It's not a huge upgrade in complexity, but it's a nice extra dose of difficulty that most of these puzzles are lacking. The only gimmick I'm not overly fond of is the red ice and blue fire. It's only used for Ice Cavern and Zora's Domain, and Ganon's Castle, and really just exists to force you to use an empty bottle, which sucks if you've already got all of yours filled, but with the cavern cleared, you get the iron boots and are ready to tackle the Water Temple. Now, the Water Temple gets a bit of a bad rap in my opinion. It's pretty rough around the edges as far as 3D Zelda dungeons go, but I can't bring myself to dislike it, and that might just be because I've played this game so many times. but that doesn't mean I won't try to attempt to explain why I think the dungeon is fairly okay. This dungeon starts off pretty weak compared to the last two, as it fails to establish a goal. A quick glance around the upper levels results in you spotting several dead ends and a ledge that you can't get up. You're just kind of dropped into the dungeon to bumble your way to finding a solution. But much like a criminal investigator, you'll have to get to the bottom of this, specifically to the bottom of the temple, by wearing iron boots. You're welcome. I suppose one could argue that the water temple treats itself as a puzzle rather than focusing on the rooms as individual puzzles, which is a valid argument, and I think those sorts of dungeons trend towards being the best dungeons in the series. But I don't think this dungeon really holds a candle to the other dungeons that have fulfilled this concept much better in both earlier and later entries. Is that a fair statement? Probably not. Moving on. You then get greeted by Princess Rudo, who doesn't give much in the way of helpful information before inexplicably vanishing. Where did she go? No, seriously, where did she go? Following the path up takes you to a key and a magic panel that allows you to lower the water level of the temple by playing a jaunty tune. Unfortunately, while this does indicate the dungeon's core mechanic, you're still not given much in the way of direction. I, even after multiple playthroughs, sometimes skip important steps to complete this dungeon just because of how odd its layout is. The best approach seems to just be combing the level and checking every single room before moving up a floor to continue. But while the conveyance is weak, I don't think it makes a bad dungeon by any stretch, despite how much time I spend grilling the game for it. No, instead I think the reason most people hate this dungeon is more to do with them missing some of the rooms on their way through it, and having to constantly cycle through all of the dungeon's water levels to backtrack is a pain in the ass. That's a lot of Ocarina playing and iron boot wearing, and admittedly, that would get quite frustrating, and has. Basically what I'm saying is everyone that dislikes this dungeon is completely justified, and I'm failing to make a case for it not deserving the verbal beating that it so regularly gets. As the dungeon itself is the puzzle, on a room-to-room basis, it doesn't really have any actual puzzles beyond some platforming here and there. The rest is more time-pressured across a room. I think the two most complex puzzles in the entire dungeon are probably the hook-shot elevation puzzle, and the room with the push-block puzzle, which is kinda sad when that's the high point. One mistake the dungeon as a whole makes that makes it difficult for people to tolerate is likely that to progress, you're actually required to lower the dungeon's water level at least twice. On its own, it doesn't sound like a problem, I suppose. On paper, it's fine. But the fact you can't lower the water level without first getting the water level to its highest point first makes it pretty tedious. And side note again, one of the reasons for the game's overall simplicity with its puzzle design and platforming is due in large part to it being the very first 3D Zelda game of this sort. I think it goes a bit too far in dumbing down the entire game and not building upon its mechanics as fast as it could, but it's as good a reason as any for its simplicity. Unlike Mario 64, Ocarina of Time doesn't really stick to the same core gameplay throughout, since it's constantly throwing new items to your arsenal, meaning the skill ceiling has to be kept somewhat low. Well, it doesn't have to, but I imagine that was their reason behind it. I think they may have overcorrected. Right, so my defense fell apart in the end there, but what do you know? At least you get the long shot, so that's pretty good, right? I don't have anything to say at all about the dungeon's main boss, so let's instead talk about a more iconic antagonistic force of the Zelda series, Dark Link. This isn't Dark Link's first appearance in the series. Prior to this, he was the final boss of Zelda 2 that I never fought, but for the Water Temple, he's a mini-boss. The introduction for this boss is pretty strong. It takes place in an illusory room with the visage of a lake, and the only way to proceed is to fight yourself. In theory, I like this idea, but the combat mechanics of the game don't really lend themselves much towards making this a fun fight. Dark Link is a pain in the ass. If you attack with your Master Sword, he can stand on your weapon and get a free hit in. It's entirely possible to beat him with just the Master Sword. I've done it. Didn't do it in this playthrough, but it's possible. But usually, you want to go for him with either the Big Oron Sword, Megaton Hammer, or Din's Fire. I'll get into the mechanical issues with the N64 Zelda combat in a later video, but suffice it to say, Ocarina of Time lacks the mechanical complexity and refinement of such complexity to make it a satisfying fight. I'm not even sure if the Big Oron, Megaton Hammer, and Din's fire methods are even intended. With how jank the combat feel is, it could very well just be an exploit. If it was intentional and they wanted you to use a weapon Dark Link couldn't imitate, then more power to him. The game certainly doesn't do it justice, though. After finishing this plumbing job, Link's then transported to a small island on Lake Hylia, so that he can listen to Sheik wax philosophically for a bit. And this seems as good a time as any to talk about Sheik, as I've mostly been avoiding it. I like Sheik. And the plot twist that Sheik is Zelda is a pretty solid one, but I'm not here to talk about what I like about Sheik, I'm here to nitpick. Up till this point in the game, Sheik has been appearing as a mysterious figure giving Link advice and teaching him an assortment of songs for teleporting. So let's break this down. While I like the world-building flavor of having multiple songs for getting around the world, in practice it just gets muddled. This is rectified in literally every Zelda game that came after, but it's still noteworthy here. All it does is add more fluff to an already mostly useless song list. Second issue, songs and tips aside, and rescuing Princess Ruto allegedly, Sheik does next to nothing. On the surface, that doesn't sound like much of a complaint, but let me put it this way. Sheik is a ninja, and literally all she does is teach you songs. Literally the only other things that she does are save Princess Ruto off-screen, and get beaten up by a ghost. Then watch Link get beaten up by a ghost. And then get kidnapped by Ganon after revealing that she's Zelda, which I remind you was probably completely unnecessary to give him the light arrow. Yes, I know I'm being petty. And on the subject of getting your ass kicked by ghosts, after clearing the water temple and restoring Lake Hylia to its former glory, you arrive in Kakariko Village to find it on fire. I'm not entirely sure why it's on fire, seeing as the ghost that burst out of the well seems to have happened after you arrived, but the fire goes out as quickly as it appears, after you and Sheik receive an ass-kicking. This signifies the last third of the game, more or less. It's also the point at which returning to Link's childhood becomes mandatory to progress. It once again requires visiting a side dungeon, the bottom of the well, but it's not a level I like to stick around. I have no thoughts on this, because ever since I was scared piss as a child, I never wanted to thoroughly explore it again, despite it not actually really bothering me anymore. Lingering dread, perhaps. A dangling fear that my old childhood anxiety born from this level might be vindicated. And it's not something I actually want to find out, even though, objectively speaking, it's in no way likely to scare me more than any of the horror games I've since played. Suffice it to say, I run in there, fight the freaky-ass Dead Hand, which is an absolutely terrifying boss conceptually, and promptly leave with my lens of truth to the foreboding catacombs of the Shadow Temple. The Shadow Temple is an interesting case. It's as hauntingly atmospheric as the Forest Temple, though I personally find the Forest Temple much creepier, personally, but that's more to do with expectations. I expect a Shadow Temple to be creepy when it's located in a cemetery, but I sure as hell don't expect a temple in the middle of a fairy forest to be scary. But that's aside the point. I like the Shadow Temple quite a lot. It's admittedly much more linear than the earlier dungeons, but the way the dungeon itself gradually evolves the deeper you delve into it makes it worth the shift in dungeon progression. Shadow Temple puzzles, for the most part, fall back onto the Silver Rupee Gathering for the most part, so instead I'll be focusing on the overall structure. Befitting a cemetery, the dungeon opens as a series of catacombs built into tightly packed graves of the Hylian past, with passages hidden by illusion that can only be revealed through the lens of truth. Spirits usher warnings about straying too deep, but regardless of whether or not you've required the lens, there's nothing to stop you from exploring regardless. This exploration is quickly rewarded as well, as this is probably the only Zelda dungeon to immediately give you this core item immediately, the hover boots. Hover boots mechanically are pretty different. Much like the iron boots, their purpose is intuitive, but the frictionless movement was an odd choice. The hover boots have a certain duality to them that allows for more freedom of movement in the environment, but forces you to commit to your movement. It's similar to the Pegasus boots of the past in a way, though admittedly more temperamental. I wouldn't say it lends itself particularly well to puzzle solving, but there are a few instances where it can accomplish more than Link's jump. Setting that aside, the most iffy feature of the dungeons are its illusions. I like it in theory. The idea of games having you confront things that you can't see makes for an engaging sense of tension and intrigue, at whether you can trust your surroundings. But the concept is hurt a fair bit by the lens of truth, which basically just unveils all illusions. It's a see things as is at the cost of magic button. It's just a waste of an item that only really exists for the developers to cheekily hide hazards, but that said, it doesn't hurt the dungeon too much. Not much further in, you come across what appears to be a strangely out-of-place ship. A ship to the afterlife, as it implies. I'm not an expert on mythology, so the only comparison that immediately comes to mind is Shar and the ferryman of Hades of the river Styx. It even floats above a bottomless pit covered in a river-esque mist. But I won't delve any deeper into this subject, because I'm pretty sure that fall is certain death. It's clear enough that the ship isn't something you can access at this moment, directing you to delve deeper into the reaches of the temple, trading the tightly packed catacombs near the surface for the far more sinister ruins below. Ridden with guillotines and deadly pits, a lot of this dungeon really attempts to push the game's platforming mechanics to their limit, which actually isn't all that high a bar in this game, but nonetheless. My favorite example of the dungeon's platforming are the large cavernous rooms with the invisible platforms and guillotines testing your timing and your ability to press button to see. I think the room I'm most fond of is the Room of Fans. It requires a mix of the iron boots and hover boots as well as the hook shot. I like it because it recontextualizes the use of the boots. Of course iron boots would keep wind from pushing you, and of course if you're wearing boots that allow you to move frictionlessly across surfaces, you're going to go careening off when you're hit by a strong gust, and you use this new context to solve a puzzle you've not encountered before. And the best part of it is that it's intuitive. It makes your items multifaceted, and it's intuitive. It's rare to see Ocarina of Time require this many items to overcome a single puzzle, so it's very much welcome. After that, you find yourself at the foot of the ship from earlier in the dungeon, finally able to proceed onto the temple's furthest depths. There's not much left of the dungeon at this point, but I do like this bit of visual direction. Upon reaching the end of the river on the boat, you find yourself facing a door across a chasm. The door is flanked on either side by a large statue that's collapsed on one side, with the head being on the end that you are standing at, with the middle section having fallen out, proving that it might have once been a crossing point. It communicates it's possible for the statues to reach across and create a path without explicitly telling you that. The intention is for the player to ignite the conspicuously set bomb flowers surrounding the statue, which causes it to collapse. It's not very complicated, but it's some nice flavor before the boss fight. That said, I do think the invisible maze for the boss key, while neat, is a bit unnecessary after the beautiful amount of build-up before. It honestly just kind of slows the pace of the dungeon down and takes the wind out of your sails after you've got the statue shot over and cross the ravine only to be met with a dead end. The boss key probably should have been earlier in the dungeon. I imagine this decision was made to ensure players didn't have to backtrack too far if they missed it, but I'm not too terribly fond of that design philosophy. But far be it from me to say it's a bad decision by any stretch. That's more my opinion than anything. But after a few more hops across invisible platforms, we find ourselves in front of Bongo Bongo. The best way to sum up this fight is that it's a natural extension of the Goma fight from the beginning of the game. The use of the hover boots basically just prevents you from being affected by the drum beats, so we'll ignore them. The battle's focus is primarily on the bow. Much like Goma, you want to stun the boss, but as an evolution of that fight, Bongo Bongo has additional hazards. For one, you can't see his main body without the lens of truth, which is stupid. Still, nice flavor for the fight. I do admittedly think it's pretty effective to see the body vanish as it passes out of the periphery of the lens, but for the first phase of the fight, the body doesn't really do anything. The first phase usually entails you divide your attention between two disembodied hands that alternate between drumming and attacking. The attacks can range from slams to much more dangerous grabs that could result in you being thrown into the poison surrounding the drums. I really like how difficult the fight makes it to keep both hands on screen without placing yourself near the edge of the arena. It creates a nice imbalance in the combat that allows you to play it safe by sticking to the center and focusing on one hand at the risk of being blindsided by another, or playing more risky and attempting to get both hands on screen at once while standing closer to the ledge. Of course, once both hands are shot, the main body will attack you itself, which, much like Goma, requires striking its center eye. This can be done with a bow or a sword if you like being edgy. The fight basically follows this pattern until death, much like every other fight, but nonetheless, I think this is one of the strongest boss fights we've come across so far. Plus, I just love Bongo Bongo's design. And with that, we move on to a rather meaty prologue section for the Spirit Temple. This will likely be the first time in the game in which you visit the Gerudo Valley proper. Until this point, the Gerudo turn you away as a child, so I've typically made a point to skip it until Link's an adult. Assuming you've got Epona at this point, there's a nice little scene where you the two leap across the valley to gain access to the town after the bridge has fallen away. You swiftly find out that a bunch of carpenters went there cruising for booty and got arrested, and it's your job to free them all. I'm rather curious how all the carpenters managed to get across the bridge with it having fallen. I'm assuming they must have crossed before it collapsed, because the alternative just raises far more questions. The Gerudo town is a lot of fun, to be honest. It's another light stealth segment, much like Hyrule Castle from earlier, but it's expanded upon. It involves exploring a moderately complex series of buildings to look for carpenters while evading or incapacitating the guards. I'm a bit surprised that a Gerudo can take an arrow and not die, but who am I to question that? Link takes quite the thrashing throughout the game, so I suppose it's not out of the question. Exploring the city is plenty of fun. Some of the buildings can feel a bit samey, and that can leave you questioning where you are in relation to the rest of the town, but nonetheless it's an interesting ride. Guards don't react to their allies being knocked out, but I can't really fault the game for that, since it's not the focus of the game. I feel like the Gerudo warriors you fight when freeing the carpenters are actually among the better fights in the game, save for their instant KO move, which incapacitates Link regardless of total hearts. Just seems a bit cheap if it catches you the wrong way. And after clearing your way through the fortress and rescuing everyone, you earn the respect of the Gerudo and become an honorary ally? Citizen? You get a pass that lets you travel freely throughout the town without an ass kicking. And that's not the end of our trials, as after this we have to cross a vast desert to actually reach the temple, which involves crossing a sea of quicksand with a hook shot, trying to follow flags laid out through a sandstorm, before eventually stumbling upon a Poe that guides you directly to the temple entrance. It's a lot more stimulating than my explanation makes it sound. I imagine if it came across as a bit jaded, it's more to do with me having done this 1,000 times and the experience having dulled as a result. Suffice it to say, the path to the Spirit Temple from the Gerudo to the Desert Trials goes a good ways in creating a strong lead-in to what is probably the best dungeon in the game. The Spirit Temple is pretty unique as far as dungeons go, being the only one that you tackle as both young and adult Link. You first discover the temple as adult Link, find that the path within is blocked by a large stone block too heavy for you to move, and a narrow pass that's too small for an adult to cross. At this point, Sheik shows up to teach you the song to return to the Spirit Temple as a child, which is, incidentally, the only way to reach this location as a child. So you do this. After that, you get to explore roughly 1/3 of the dungeon after being sent in by an ego Gerudo thief Naburu to get some gloves so she can move the aforementioned stone block. The Young Link portion utilizes all of the items you've acquired thus far quite effectively and goes a good ways in pushing the combat to its limits. This dungeon also introduces you to my favorite enemy in the entire game, the Dark Nut. Okay, it's the Iron Knuckle. I don't know, man. It's kind of a semantic thing. For all intents and purposes, Iron Knuckles and Dark Nuts fulfill the same role, so I'm calling them Dark Nuts. It's like arguing the difference between Bokoblins and Moblins. Same song, different verse. Dark Nuts are pretty straightforward, like most Ocarina of Time battles. They're big, slow, and punish your mistakes severely. I think their moveset lends itself well to the game's clunky combat design. Their attacks are slow enough that reacting in time won't typically result in horrific injury unless you misjudge distance, and unlike a lot of enemies in Ocarina of Time, Dark Nuts do not block or have iframes like the Lizalfos, which, alongside the Dark Nut's lack of speed, means it's a fight where the player dictates the pace of the battle. It feels great to take down one of these, and it's just a shame we don't get to see them more often. That said, after obtaining the gloves for Naburu, she immediately gets kidnapped by Twinrova, and you're left to your own devices, which of course means returning to the future and moving the giant stone yourself, with the very gloves you nicked. The second portion of the dungeon more or less mirrors the Young Link section in terms of room layout. but has more interesting, challenging puzzles that accommodate the change in items available. It's interesting exploring a dungeon that has this kind of parallel, but I don't think it adds much compared to the final third of the dungeon, where it really opens up. There's not much for me to add in regards to the dungeon puzzles. They're all good, but that's about it. So instead, I want to talk about this dungeon's centerpiece, which you come across as early as Young Link's section of the dungeon, which is of course the large goddess statue. That's the core of both some minor platforming sections, and is clearly important to all but the most oblivious. The only thing I find mildly disappointing about it is that even though it serves as an entrance to the boss room, that's not apparent until you take an elevator down and are face to face with the face of the statue. I suppose it could be taken and it's supposed to be a hidden entrance of sorts, since this place belongs to thieves, and since the dungeon itself never loses it as a centerpiece, I'm not really too bothered by it. The hookshot door is a bit odd, though, to say the least. Such a thing never happens again. Shortly thereafter, you have another encounter with what should be your third Dark Nut, and the quality, of course, persists. But in a surprising twist, the Dark Nut turns out to be Naburu under the control of Twinrova, who the Twinrova promptly teleport away? Kill her? I'm honestly not entirely sure on the dead or alive status of the sages in this game. At any rate, if they're fully capable of doing something like this, I have to wonder why they didn't just do the same thing to Link instead. That said, Twinrova is a cool fight. I don't like Phase 1 in the slightest, but conceptually across the board it's pretty interesting. The core item of the dungeon is the mirror shield. Up till this point it's mostly been used to reflect light for puzzle solving purposes. But it has a similar application in this fight, as it's used to reflect the beams of Kome and Kotake that are fired off at Link. The goal being to hit Kome with Kotake's ice beam and vice versa with Kome's fire beam. I absolutely love this, in theory, but in practice it's a bit finicky. Most of the problem derives from the pathing of the twins. There's seemingly no distinct pattern to their movement, so it seems like luck of the draw as to whether or not the two will actually position themselves in such a way that both are on screen where you can hit them. I think generally fighting without the lock-on works better since you can actually aim with your shield, but regardless it's not so difficult to fight that it really gets in the way of the fun. I consider it a pretty major flaw in an otherwise great fight though, but not worth dwelling on. So let's talk about Phase 2. After that, they merge, now being a single sorceress that can freely alternate between both fire and ice. The concept of the fight changes yet again. Rather than reflecting, the mirror shield now absorbs the elements. When you absorb the same element 3 times, it is returned to Twinrova, stunning her for an attack. However, if you get absorb an element that you don't already have absorbed, then you take damage instead, and it resets the state of the shield. It's a good fight, it's just a shame I can't show off the multiple beam damages for Phase 2, because as luck would have it, Twinrova just spammed the exact same element on repeat. Made it alarmingly easy. After that, you get a rather comedic scene that gets a good chuckle out of me every time I view it, with Kome and Kotake arguing about their age as they ascend to heaven. But why are they going to heaven? Maybe Link is the— At this point, it's time to return to the Temple of Time to meet with Sheik, who reveals herself to be Zelda so she can hand us the light arrow and then immediately find herself kidnapped by Ganondorf, presumably for revealing herself and setting off his Triforce detector, which, you know, fair enough. I'm just left wondering why exactly Sheik had to reveal herself to be Zelda while giving you the light arrows immediately within Ganon's domain in the temple that leads to the Sacred Realm, and transforming using the very power that he's seeking. I don't know. It just doesn't seem very wise. After she's kidnapped, it's time to head over to the castle. But before that, I want to talk about the trade sequence for the Big Oron Sword, as it's the only side activity I do every time I play, and I think it's fairly engaging. There's technically a trade sequence as Young Link as well, but Adult Link's is more fun and interesting and has better rewards, so we're going with that one. Much like the trade items of Young Link, the chain begins once again with Talon from Lonron Ranch and a Cuckoo. After that, you trade the now happy Cuckoo that's woken up Talon for a blue cranky Cuckoo, which you give to a sad boy, and continue along until you eventually get the Big Oron Sword. I didn't actually want to go into detail on how you accomplish this, but I'm of two minds about their approach to the side quest. The vast majority of the trades involve a time limit. This makes for a fun race as you test your knowledge of the layout of Hyrule, but I prefer the other Zelda game approaches, where the trade wasn't based on how quickly you can get to a location, but whether you knew where the location and the NPC that wanted the item were based on previous dialogues you've had with them. Ocarina of Time, of course, does this to an extent, but in most scenarios where you trade, the time limits usually result in the game just straight up telling you where to go, and what NPCs to speak with. I'm just nitpicking though, of course. I'm for a Zelda game to have a trade sequence of any kind, so long as it's good and has a reward worth the trouble. I was originally planning to talk about the combat mechanics in detail, but this video is getting far too long as is, so I just thought I'd tell you that I'm going to save that for a future video on Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time that tackles the combat of both. That said, with all the medallions I've been neglecting to talk about, we can finally make our way across the lava-filled ravine to Ganon's castle. The interior of Ganon's castle is immediately imposing, seemingly built into the harsh stone of the bedrock of Hyrule Castle, with the obvious way forward being blocked by a magical barrier tied to separate challenges based on the previous temples you've been to. For the most part, these challenges are the same as previous dungeons you visited, at least thematically. But oddly enough, the puzzles themselves aren't necessarily the same as their temples. The Water Temple section, for example, is based almost entirely on the ice caverns instead of the Water Temple itself. Additionally, a large focus of the puzzles in these segments are centered around silver rupees. The Forest Temple probably has the most interesting of these gathering puzzles, at least in comparison to the Fire Temple, of which the major hazard can simply be overcome by wearing hover boots. But that's aside the point. The real standout of Ganon's castle, and really the only one worth talking about, is the Light Temple segment. A temple that's not properly featured in the game, and is only merely referred to in cutscenes. It features trap chests and illusions, and it's got a lot in common with the Spirit Temple in my opinion. It doesn't differentiate itself enough to really stand out too much, but I felt it was worth bringing up since this is the only representation that temple gets in the game. The only bit of it that I really like is the fake-out wall for the barrier, but I don't think anyone would fall for that illusion with or without the Lens of Truth. But nonetheless, it's a nice addition. With that, all that's left is to ascend the tower, which is basically just a spiral staircase, which features my favorite enemy as an obstacle. The most striking thing about the ascent to the top is the growing organ music that increases in volume as you get closer to the top. The payoff is great as well, as once you reach Ganondorf, you get a cutscene that shows the music was in fact diegetic, and was being played by Ganondorf himself. So talented. Followed by him extrapolating on how the Triforce fragments affect one another, and due to the overwhelming power of the Triforce of Power, it leaves Navi unable to assist you in battle, allegedly. At any rate, everything about the Ganondorf fight is spot on. Phase 1 is basically Phantom Ganon Phase 2 again, but good this time. Another game of energy tennis with the added step of having to shoot Ganon with a light arrow before you attack him with your sword. My favorite attack is when Ganon lines up a massive multi-hit energy ball, because I get to deflect it with my own spin attack, and it just looks so freaking rad when you hit all of them at the same time. But after repeating this process and getting those attacks in the last-ditch effort, Ganondorf brings down his entire castle around you, which makes for an excellent set-piece moment. It's a race against time as you avoid parts of the collapsing tower while fending off Ganon's minions that continue to fight as you and Zelda try to escape. The only real negative is that it's not very challenging, even with the time limit, and that's mostly due to a combination of these two things. Namely, the dungeon's simple spiral staircase design that even applies to the exterior, and Zelda guiding you out. As long as you stay right behind her, you'll make it out virtually unscathed. With your escape secured, the castle collapses into a perfect arena shape for a final ship. Oh, that was just for the cutscene. Okay, it's just scattered rubble. Link and Zelda notice movement from within. And as it turns out, Ganon is very much alive, and in a fit of rage uses the power of the Triforce to transform into a far more traditional and sinister beast form. He deflects Link's Master Sword out of the arena before surrounding the arena with flames, preventing its retrieval, and it makes for a really interesting moment where you're required to utilize another weapon. Which, in my case, I was already using the big Oron sword anyway, so, you know. But the Megaton Hammer is also viable. After getting a few good hits in on Ganon's weak point, his tail, he becomes stunned just long enough for Link to retrieve his Master Sword to engage him in a final showdown. I like the fight against Beast Ganon for a number of reasons, and the number of reasons themselves are in direct proportion to the number of combat options you have at your disposal. Between melee weapon options, your ultimate objective of hitting his tail can be achieved a number of ways. There may be more, but these are the two I know. You can stun him by shooting him in the face with light arrows and circle around to attack the tail, or my favorite approach of just rolling between his legs and attacking him that way. I imagine there are yet more methods I haven't been bothered to experiment with, but much like Bongo Bongo and Twin Rova, this is a cut above the game's usual boss battles. I'd even go as far as to call it the peak of the boss designs in this game. After you've landed the requisite number of hits, Ganon falls under Zelda's light beam, and with one last hit, you seal him away in the Sacred Realm. Link and Zelda have a rather somber moment where she sends Link back to his original time period, though the moment that really got to me as a child was when Navi leaves you. I know I haven't really talked about Navi that much, because I usually just ignore her these days, but I never really found her annoying. I really enjoyed her company on the journey when I was a kid, so seeing her leave Link without a word was a bit of a blow. But with that, we've reached the end of this video. I don't think I need to explain why I enjoyed this credit sequence, so I'll just let it play out. It's kind of difficult to bring something original to the table when talking about a game as thoroughly picked apart as Ocarina of Time, but I hope that regardless of whether or not you got anything new out of it, you still enjoyed it, and most importantly, I hope this video lit a fire under you.